The kingfisher is kind of like a watchman. It sits on top of a tree, and when they see other people coming on their canoes from other places, it makes that certain noise, and it warns the people that there's other people coming. I imagine that there was a lot of our ancestors at the time would be camping along our whole waterfront where the black soil and a lot of the shells are before the band amalgamated down to Sechelt here. Sechelt was a home for the winter, and then during the summers they would all go back up into the inlets to gather whatever their specialties would be.
When Europeans first came, it started in the east and moved west here to the British Columbia. When they arrived, they described it as like a resource mecca. There was just, you could walk on the water. There was so much fish. And the way I look at it is our people lived in harmony with the environment and knew how to take care and sustain their resources. You have hunting and gathering societies, although we also practiced extensive aquaculture and forms of agriculture through transplanting and pruning and keeping our berry bushes really healthy and sustainable. They say the Squamish people pre-contact might have numbered 30,000 people, and the Sechelt people potentially over 20,000 people.
There were many thousands of natives in this area, many powerful chiefs who lived in this area, and they dictated what was happening in this region. So they dictated how life was conducted. Marriages were arranged, potlatches were held for many months. Dances, songs, names, all originated from this area.
What I've been taught about what life was like was how we were very interdependent in our living, and whatever you harvested, hunted, it was always shared. And the highest quality you could have would be generosity. And people never focused on the accumulation of wealth. It was always redistributed. It's all the strengths and skills we have that make us a tribe.
We lived in Khanichin. Papa and Grandma and other relatives, other people that lived there in Khanichin. It was a small band, and same with Sonai. As you know, years ago, at that time, before my time, smallpox killed off a lot of people there. I heard 7,000, then other people saying, no, it wasn't that many. Well, I don't know, that's what I heard on the stories. And they had fast runners and strong paddlers to go up north, talking about the smallpox, to stay away from Vancouver is where they got it from.
In all of our experiences today as a community, what's special to me is knowing how closely we're related, that we've all derived from the same ancestors. And I've always been told which ancestors they were. They were Tlachlamai, Chatsinowit, Cheney, and Akista. How important it is to know your relations within your community as well as the neighboring tribes, how you relate to the land. Even myself growing up, harvesting berries, fishing, having uncles and cousins that hunt. Like, that's what makes you who you are. That's what makes you Sechelt.
Joe Lidelli was my great-great-grandfather. And Joe Lidelli came from Vancouver Bay. And he lived there alone until he married his wife. And she came from Thormanby Island. So when he was courting her, he had to canoe his way all the way from Vancouver Bay to Thormanby Island. Yeah, but here's one of Joe Liddell's sons, who's my great-grandfather, and his name is Basil Joe. Basil's the first one to attend residential school. They were the first students, my great-grandfather. When he went to school, Basil, he didn't know how to read or write and speak English. He didn't speak English. Even when I was growing up, he didn't speak much English. They wanted him to sign his name, so they put an X in. They said, instead of Liddell, they said, we're just going to call you your last name Joe, because it's simpler for you. So they took our name Liddell, Joe Liddell, and then took Joe Liddell's first name Joe, and then that's how we became Joes. We're really our Liddells, yeah. Basil died when I was 13, and when I was about 11, he took me outside in the front of his house, and he had huge hands, and he said, see that rock over here, and that rock over there? I said, yeah. He said, that's our land, don't you ever forget it.
We're the Mayooks. My ring size is 15. My grandfather, Basil, was 23. And I remember sitting on his lap as a kid and playing with his aluminum ring. It was aluminum, and it was probably, I would say, that big. And I was amazed. I used to put my fingers through it, right? And I don't know whatever happened to that aluminum ring, but we're the Mayooks. We always had big hands. My dad had big, huge hands, right? My dad's name was Mayook, and I got passed that name down to me, right? Which I'm very proud to hold today. I'm the only one in the nation with that name. We used to go up to Huntington. We used to go logging up there. My grandfather would get a logging permit, and he would have his sons, William, Junior, Gilbert, and all of them fall in and log in, and we'd stay in the camp, right? It was so great. You know, we're living off the land, we're staying in these camps, mom and them cooking. To us, it was a holiday. Very good days, you know, I loved them. You know, I'll never forget those days. Like they say, when you're poor in those days, you're closer to your family than you are, right? I'll never forget those days. We're all happy.
We were living in a bounty full of wealth where we didn't have to go to the store and pay for it, you know? We didn't have to go pay for oysters. We got it free. We got our clams free from Bear Bay. The things that we had to do with the clams was shucking them out of the shell and sticking them on a stick, like 8 of them on one stick. And they'd hang them in the sun to dry. And this is another food that we put away for the winter. You take it off the stick in the winter and you chew on it like gum. It was dry, it was chewy. So that was another staple that we always preserved. It was clams on a stick. We had berries. Granny did preserves. We did the clams on a stick. We dried oysters too. Granny dried a lot of flowers, and she put these tasty flowers in with our suppers. She said, "Eat it; it's good." And those were the thimbleberry.
You know, I hated plucking ducks. That's the thing I hated when I was a kid, right? My dad was the hunter of the family. He was such a great shot. He was like a sniper, and he would go out and shoot 5 deers and a white goat. And my great-grandfather, Basil, the delicacy to him was the goat's stomach.
During the 1930s, our people were still not really immersed in Western commodities or staples. So during the Depression, when things became really scarce, like coffee, flour, sugar, our elders said that the fellow non-Indigenous community members, it was a real sacrifice for them not to have those foods. So they used to give their rations to the non-Sechelt people because they actually thought they needed them more because they were suffering more without them.
Grandpa would always say, only take what you need. And that's what we went by, is taking only what we needed.
Growing up in that environment, it was fantastic. You know, we all had our jobs to do in those days, and you know, we're all poor, but we're the happiest.
That was my life. And then, you know, I was a happy little girl when I lived up there. And, you know, like when we had that place up there, everybody was happy. When we came to Sechelt, our happiness ended. And that was due to residential school.
As you know, we all 4 generations went to that residential school.
There was my great-grandfather, Basil, went to residential school. Then my grandmother and grandfather went to residential school. My mom and dad, and then me, 4 generations of residential school. So you can imagine how dysfunctional that became for us. Very dysfunctional.
Hey, there's the residential school.
Where was it? Grandpa?
This was near the road where Uncle Howie's house is now.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the front was.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Isn't that something?
Was it bad in there?
It was bad. It's a sad history, but it made us stronger, right? It did. You know, it made us, all of the Sechelt Nation, strong people, right? We're all fighters, right? You know, warriors, right? So that warrior blood always came out and helped us to survive, right?
It was funny, I went to church in the 80s, and my husband said to me, "Why do you go to church? I don't understand you. Didn't they do horrible things to you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, they did, but I was still brainwashed. I had children already. I had all my children, 4 of them, but I was still going to church." And then I realized when he said that, I said, "Yeah, this is not my religion." And the first time I seen a masked dancer, the syiyyaya, as soon as they started singing and dancing, I burst out crying, just lost it, because that was who I was. That was who I was. And it was amazing. It was beautiful. Everything was so amazing. And I identified with it immediately. I had never seen it before. I had nothing to identify myself with. And so when I identified with the syiyyaya dancers, I knew I had to learn more.
Here we are in Sechelt, with an acreage that extends from Trail Bay to Porpoise Bay, and not even a neighbour yet.
Trees, huge, fern, cedar and hemlock as far as the eye can see.
It's like a park.
Some park, it's full of bears.
I always loved the sea. Here in Sechelt, I can walk on the beach and not see another living soul.
That's not always a good thing. A few years after we arrived, I came down with a very painful intestinal disease. No doctors around here. We couldn't afford to take the boat to Vancouver. I was terrified. Then 2 women from the Sechelt band, Mrs. Paul and Mrs. August, offered to treat me using their traditional medicines. I was desperate, so I agreed. Their medicines are based on the forest plants, and they worked.
To treat a cold, we wrap the person in a blanket and we steam them. For cuts, we use pine tar pitch. And for skin infections, we use skunk cabbage. And we use Oregon grape for pain.
Those ladies saved my life. I tried to thank Mrs. Paul, but she said, the Creator made those plants powerful. Thank Him, not us. You owe us nothing. We women had to rely on each other for help with, well, you know, health matters.
Oh, leave me out of this.
Do you have high blood pressure?
I don't know.
When someone has a stroke, we put them in a mud bath, and mud from Porpoise Bay.
Does it work?
Sometimes.
Just like now, sometimes you recover from a stroke, sometimes you don't. Mid-30s, okay. The Columbia Coast Mission, who ran up and down the coast here with their mission boats, and they married and buried and preached and did all that sort of stuff, they decided to build a hospital in Pender Harbor. But the trouble with the doctors in those days was a lot of them were misfits. They were alcoholics trying to dry out. One guy didn't even have a license, on and on. And they were sort of run out of the community by the community, lasting maybe a year at a time. They'd phone Cannon Green and say to him, send us another one. We don't want this one. He said to me, it was like room service, you know, send us up another one. Anyway, that's how things went until about 1955, when the first of a group of young doctors who were reasonably with it, as it were, and stable, and not addicted to anything, started appearing. First it was Alan Swan, and then it was myself, and then it was Walter Burtnick. And when I came here in 1959, I came here to stay for a 2-week locum, and I knew within 3 days I was never going to leave. This was paradise.
Dad, he used to tell stories about being a minority in BC before the war and after the war. He was on the island, I won't say which community, but he was logging there. And there was always a white camp and a Japanese camp. And of course, the Caucasian loggers got more money and all that kind of stuff. But he was talking about walking down the mountain one day, and he came into town, and one of the restaurants had a sign that said, no dogs, no Japs. So it was quite racist in those days. Well, during the war, my parents were originally interned at Hastings Park. Dad was sent to a work camp to build a road, and Mom and the kids, there were 3 of them at that time, stayed in Hastings Park. And when Dad was finished at the road camp, the authorities allowed him to move. The Japanese had the choice of going to an internment camp or living 200 miles off the coast. So he moved down to Beaton, and he called up for the kids and Mom to stay with him. Yeah, they settled there, and they were welcomed by the community, to the point where they raised money for them because Dad wanted to go back to the coast. I think he saw far more opportunity here. And probably he liked the coast, he liked the water and everything. That's all we really heard about it. The hard stuff we never really heard about. They never said too much about the negative stuff. That's the Japanese way. After the experience of being interned, Dad and Mom decided that their children, us, were never going to be the receiving end of such racism and such hatred. So as a result, my parents never spoke Japanese to us at home. They were quite insistent that we were not just integrated, but we were assimilated into the community.
In order to create a balance between life and spirit, there was a religion in our culture called winter spirit dancing. That would allow the spirit to come into the reality of life. So the spirit would come into life and be able to perform, to sing, to dance, to express their religion. It's an expression of my ancestors, my forefathers.
St. Patrick's Day used to be a fairly big deal. Everybody would gather at the old Legion for big haggis dinners and music. Music was a big thing. Everybody seemed to have their own instrument. And seeing there was no entertainment on, no television, and very little radios. So that was a big part of the local scene too. Square dancing was pretty popular. Okay. Yeah, I still remember Morris Hem Street used to be the swing your partner, do-si-do. Yeah, my parents loved to square dance. They couldn't understand why I didn't like it much, but I didn't.
When I first started weaving, I went up to my late grandmother, Carrie Jo, and I said, Gran, I just started weaving wool. And then she goes, I'm so happy that you're doing that because our family were the great weavers. She goes, I remember looking at my grandmother weave, so that would have been my great-grandmother, and she remembers watching her grandmother do that. So it's in my blood, and I did not know. And now, every time I weave now, I dream about it, I think about it, I put my life into it, and it's just in my blood. It didn't take them long to make things. I always remember sitting beside them when I was a little girl and watching them weave and do basket work, and how quiet they were when they were doing it and how fast. Back in those days, they used to make medicine capes. A medicine cape is basically like a wool cape, but it has, susu, stinging nettle. We call it susu in our language. Okay, the stinging nettle was pushed in and weaved into with the wool. And so when somebody got sick in the winter, they take this cape out and they put it on them when they're sweating and they're sick, and their pores are open when they're sweating, and it would get into their system and make them better. And I haven't seen one of those capes in years, and I'm gonna make one. Weaving has just been brought back probably about 15 years ago to our community. So it went away because I would say the churches came in and they didn't like to see us doing this. They wanted us to convert into their religion. And this would be a regalia of ours. You could weave a tunic, which is kind of like a poncho. You put it over your head. You can weave headbands that go around your head. You can weave aprons that match your shawl, and you can make leggings. That's what the men wear on theirs. And you can also incorporate weaving into cedar.
One thing unique to Coast Salish is the cedar root baskets, because that's what we had in abundance. And being a Sechelt person, all of us were born and raised with grandmothers, grandaunts that would be just renowned, elaborate weavers. And traditionally, when you looked at a basket, you would understand whose family it came from the design elements. And what took place after contact, and especially with the visitors, the tourists that would travel to the Sunshine Coast through the Union Steamship, would be they had expressed interest in our baskets, so the woman would assist and support their families through basket making.
I always thought when I was a little girl, I'm gonna do that one day, and I've done it, and now I know what they talk about when they're saying roots are harder, because root baskets are harder. It's more precision than weaving baskets. And so I always admired their technique on how fast it went for them. I remember them dragging us up the hill, them getting all the cedar, rolling it all up, all the work we had to do for them and bring it home to them. And that was just a job.
One of the things I enjoy growing up in a community that is based in a oral tradition was you grew up with older people in your community that your parents and your grandparents know more closely because they grew up together. And my mom would share with me, you know, what I thought was magic. She would share with me like people's talents, or if they were able to commune with nature, or maybe even commune with the spirits. And I think that's a pretty special way to grow up.
I grew up in a natural environment of being in the wild with not only the killer whales, sea lions, and in them days they were like giants, right? We used to swim with the sea lions, we used to swim with the killer whales, and there was no fear. They were just like a brotherhood.
We'd stop underneath this big cherry tree in Huntington, where there was a lot of fruit trees in those days, right? And we'd pick all the cherries, and you know, just on our own time, right? You know, and my grandfather, Clarence Joe, had the logging. We used his old gill natter as a boom boat to boom the boats up, right? But very good days. You know, I loved them. You know, I'll never forget those days.
Everybody had a job. You know, we weren't afraid to walk into the bush. We weren't afraid of bears, anything. We were just natural natives in the bush. Dishes, I didn't really care for doing dishes, but it wasn't bad going down to the river with it. You know, like we could sit in the water. And to me, the river was not cold. It was just normal. We spent a lot of time in the water. I think we spent half the time in the water and half the time on land. We lived by what we were provided with, and that wasn't much, but we were happy. We were very happy there. The only time we came into Sechelt when we were 17 grandchildren on a gill netter with their grandfather, with no life jackets on, going through the chuck, pulling it. You know, it was a lot of fun. And we never lost any kids on the boat, and we'd sing all the way down there. I don't know what we sang, but you know, everything was so much fun living up Jervis Inlet with my family.
I grew up in Roberts Creek on the highway. The highway wasn't near as busy as it is now. In fact, my brothers had built a swing on a branch that was over the highway. And they would swing out in front of traffic, scare the crap out of everybody. And they did this until they encountered a semi. As a kid, it was the best place to be. I mean, everybody talks about how awful their childhood was, and, you know, dysfunctional families and stuff like that. And we had such freedom. It was amazing what freedoms we had. Incredible freedom, incredible freedom. You would go to your neighbors to play with the kids, not a problem. Yeah, and you know, you were welcomed into the house, all houses in the neighborhood. Like, we always left our door unlocked, always.
I was born in that house, and extreme winter tides would come right up around the house. The beach was just down here, and there was a creek running down here. This is all strawberries. And yeah, it was kind of amazing that they would do so well there, seeing they were covered with salt water for a week or two every year.
We loved our life up there, especially jumping off that little wharf and swimming was the best. That would have been a still picture I would have loved to have taken. God, those were the best days of my life.
Yeah, they were rough and tumble times, especially I guess back in the old days when it was all done by hand with the hand crosscut saws. I still remember my dad falling trees with a hand crosscut saw. Well, in the early days, they did a lot of horse and oxen logging, and then steam came around, and so they started using spar trees, and they could reach out a long way and drag the logs in. But basically they were all moved the same way, wrap a cable around them and give it a pull with something. Drag it to the water, usually, yeah. When I was a boy, my dad had a Caterpillar, an iron track machine that they used. He was brought up with sawmills in the family too. Oh, it was good, clean, honest, hard work. Well, I guess it wasn't always that clean, a lot of sawdust involved. But it was just something, everybody seemed to do the same thing on the coast except for the merchants in Sechelt.
My father actually, I think at the age of 14 or something like that, he became a logger. And he's logged all his life right up to 1981. He was a real camp person. A lot of our band members have worked with him. He had a lot of knowledge about logging, but he was quite the clown too. So yeah, he'd play tricks on those guys and up in the woods. A couple of the fellows that worked with him, he used to take their lunch and nail their lunch can down onto a log or a stump, whatever, and they'd be trying to yank it away, and they know who did it. Johnny Paul.
Before the war started, Dad had worked for logging camps here. And he had a contract logging firm with a man called Mr. Jackson. So he had logging rights to islands in Toba Inlet. The war came, they took everything away from him. And then, like every Japanese, they had the internment story. After the war, Mr. Jackson called Dad back. He wanted Dad to work for him again. In 1951, they came down here again. And this Mr. Jackson helped Dad buy 17 acres on the Sunshine Coast Highway. He always wanted to come back, from what I understand. And so when the opportunity came and this Mr. Jackson, got in contact with him and asked him to come back, he was more than happy to.
I remember there was a bad accident in the bay here in probably 1955 or so. 6 loggers were drowned just right in Porpoise Bay on their way home from work one day. And yeah, it was pretty upsetting. They were all friends of the family. Actually, my brother was supposed to be on that boat, but he didn't go that day.
They were basically all patients of ours, or mine, and I remember 6 months after the drowning, I delivered one of the wives' kids. What a bittersweet moment that was. Anyway.
I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, Captain Joe Dixon, and my grandmother, whom I call Mama. and my grandfather is Papa, and he had a little hand line made up for me. At that time, there was a lot of fish. There was so much salmon in the inlets, you practically walk across it. There was that many salmon. And when he told me to, in our language, to put the line out, be only about 5-10 feet on the stern of the dugout canoe, I already have one on. That's how much salmon was in the inlets long time ago. Today, you could troll for a week, maybe get one salmon.
Our people depended on the salmon. You know, we're up and down this coast, we're all the salmon people. Fishing goes back a long ways in our culture. The salmon we used to catch, spring salmon, 100-pound spring salmons. You know, the smaller ones were 50 pounds. And I remember my dad teaching me the areas when I was, 11, 12 years old. When I was probably, I would say probably eight years old until I was 13, I fished with my father on his little boat. It was called the Miss Richmond too. And we used to go up to Rivers Inlet every summer. My grandfather, Clarence Joe, we'd go up out jigging and he would tell me, he says, this area here, you'll get these little red snappers. He said, this is the only area you can get them, right? And this is a family secret, he says, right? And I still know where that area is. In those days, there were so many canneries on the coast. The fishing was abundant.
I tell you, up at Jarvis Inlet, my home lands up there, is the salmon up there. As a child, I could not believe how big they were. So it was nothing for men or women to go out and catch a big salmon on a rod. So we'd go up the beach and cook it, open fire. 3 hours of cooking. And while it's cooking, you could see the fat dripping on the bottom. And you go, God, can't wait to tie into that. Because it's always so good, fresh salmon out of the water, and you do an open fire on the beach, and you're forever wiping your lips, I taught a guy that wrote a book of recipes. It was a good 1.5-inch thick book, and all recipes from different people. And then, of course, he was putting mine in there, and he says, I would like to learn how to do that, Jamie. I said, as Ma was sharing anyways, and he said, oh, that's great. You don't mind if I take any pictures? And I said, no, you can't. Why? He's looking, why can't I take your picture? Is it because they're going to take your spirit away? No, you haven't got the lens off, I told him.
That picture up there in the high corner, I don't know if you know Jamie Dixon or any of the Dixons. Well, that's Johnny. That's Jamie's dad's old boat. It was just such a neat old boat. I used to love that boat. Nothing fancy about it. It's like a big old canoe. It was fast. It was always one of the first ones to the fishing grounds. So. And Johnny was, well, if you know the Dixons, they got it from Johnny. He was a character. He was a good guy. I wish I had a picture of him.
Every year we go with the dory with oars. I'd be rowing the skiff. Yeah, lots of fun though. To see lots of land, different places, and fish canneries. And for me to experience with Papa, no radar, no compass, and he'd carve out a stick and have a soup bowl, put water in, and he puts the stick in there with a heavy end, the way it's carved, okay. And that gives them the directions. From the look up into the sky, he'd check the surroundings. He'd find north, and he'd look at the homemade compass that's in the bowl, and he'd tell you where you're going, where you're at. Yeah, and I learned that from him.
My father used to get cut off from hunting. The government would cut us off, and deliberately.
and starve us that way. In those days, you know, there's no welfare or anything, right? We lived off the land, right? And the government's telling us we couldn't do it. I remember my mom struggling to feed the family. There was 9 of us in the family, and she would say, there's only so much food here. Sister Rena, she ate her food fast because she was hungry, and she came over and she was standing and she was looking at my food, right? And I just pushed it over to her. I said, you can have it. And my mom would come over, she says, you know, you're probably not going to eat for 2 or 3 days, you know? And I said, that's fine. And I said, I can get food myself. I said, you know, in those days, I used to do a lot of stealing just to survive, you know, going into the grocery stores and taking whatever I needed. Of course, I got caught some of the times, but it was either that or starved to death.
We had basically the oldest children of each family had to stand back from a table and let the small ones eat. And we didn't mind, you know, because we can go forage. But that they had such a hold over all the First Nations peoples. Forestry was the people who worked for hunting and wildlife. They were worse than the police watching our band members.
Sometimes we went to school hungry. I just remember getting a lot of stomach aches when I was a little girl. My son said, what was in your fridge when you were a little girl, Mom? I said, we didn't have a fridge.
The cougar lady and her family, they lived in the next encampment to us, and they'd always come and ask for things, always, you know, like there was a lot of people, the first non-natives that moved to our inlet, you know, they'd always come to our encampment and ask for food. And like my grandfather was a giving person. He never asked for a thank you or a payment or anything. He just helped them. And then that's how they started learning, was coming to us and learning how they had to survive in the bush. And that's, I was telling everybody, I'm like, well, nobody knows the real story, right? You know, like, we have to start telling these real stories.
I don't know if you know about Roberts Creek in the 60s, which was Hippieville, okay? You've probably heard of that, eh? And the hippies were there, lots of them. And a lot of them were Americans, and they would come into the clinic with pregnant wives or girlfriends or whatever, and or they had some sickness. And the first thing they would say is, I got no bread, man. And yet they had an expensive camera around their neck. They were Americans, and they offered to do some work. None of them ever did, of course. And yeah, they were very interesting times with the hippies. They weren't bad people, they were just different. They liked to do their dope and just drift, as it were.
There's more people, way more people than there used to be. And it used to be you knew everybody. You couldn't get away with anything because someone somehow would get the information back to your parents.
Hello, I'm Grace Kent. Mr. Burt Whitaker let us set up school in one of his houses, but then he was offered $7 a month for it by the government so they could run a telegraph office. The only place that we could hold classes was a fisherman's shack on Porpoise Bay. The shack is built over the water, so it's damp all the time. Someone always has a cold. Doesn't stop them from playing jokes on me. The worst was the dead rat in my coat sleeve. I live at Mr. Whitaker's hotel, and the surveyors in the next room drove me crazy at first. They tied tin cans onto a string and dangled them out the window and scared everyone with the noise they made banging on the building. I'm heading back to civilization on the steamer at the end of the term, but I'll miss the dance parties in the bar. But not those rough loggers who get drunk every Saturday.
I'm sure the nuns were not real teachers. We did a little bit of math. They called it arithmetic. And this is what one teacher said to me. We had to learn how to spell arithmetic. And when you're young, arithmetic is a hard word to spell. And this is how she told me how I should remember how to spell arithmetic. She said, a rude Indian thought he might eat tobacco in church. That's how she made me learn the spelling of arithmetic. And I never forget that, never forgot it. It's stuck in here. And I'm 67 years old now, and it's still there.
We were happy to get ready to go to school. We're all happy. We didn't know what we were walking into.
The first thing I learned when I went to school was I was a sinner. Did you ever hear the word sinner?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a sinner, and I was like 5 years old, so I didn't know what a sin meant. It was like a scary word for me. And so I was told I was a sinner right off the bat. The Roman Catholic Church was the one that was implementing our schooling. So it was based around mostly religion. Religion, heaven, hell, purgatory, limbo. I learned all those words that year. It was pretty scary when you thought you were going to go to hell.
All day, every day, prayers, prayers, prayers. When you get up in the morning, by our bed, we have to have a prayer. Before you wash up, you had a prayer. Before you go back to the dormitory, you had to have a prayer. You had to make up your bed before you leave the dormitory, you had to pray. Before we go into the dining room, you had to have a prayer. And before we sit down, we have a prayer before we eat. When we finish eating, we have to have a prayer. Hail, Hail Mary, hail this, hail that, hell that, hell this, I said.
When we came to the residential school, all I learned was hunger, because you could smell the food in the residential school cooking, and it would make you hungry, right? Because you'd smell it all day.
There was like constant stories about how the priests, the brothers, and the nuns ate like kings and queens with fresh cream and cheese. All of the food that was the labors of the children. They were labor camps, but the children never got to have the same type of food.
My dad slipped once when he was talking about residential school. He said if I was up at 4 o'clock every morning picking eggs and milking the cows, why was I starving? So they were starving up there. And he says, we had dry mush, and sometimes our toast would have mold on it, and they would still feed it to us. And then he stopped because he felt the emotion coming on, and he never ever said another word again. Didn't want to talk about it.
You couldn't talk to your friend or your brother or your sister or your cousins. We're not allowed to. We weren't allowed to speak one native word or were punished. We were not even allowed to speak to any of our parents or grandparents walking by the residential school. We were not allowed to wave at them. We'd get the strap.
Actually, the only time you could see your parents or relatives was Christmas break, Easter, and summer. In between those time periods is when you were, just strictly in the residential school, and that was it. Been in the residential school for 10 years, so, I lost a lot of pretty much my childhood. I actually learned to speak Latin more fluently than I did our language because of the Catholic religion.
All our songs were done in Latin, so I could sing in Latin when I was a little girl. Mm-hmm. Isn't it unreal? Singing in Latin, speaking some French. Never knew my own language. And when I heard my own language being spoken by Granny, my grandfather and grandmother, I thought it was an odd language.
You do what you're told. everything. Yeah. And whoever was out of line, they got their ears pulled from behind with one of the oblates or the nuns. Even the priests used a ruler, a yardstick, to give you lashes. When I was in grade 7, I took a strap away from a priest. There, grabbed it, pulled it out of his hand, and I started whipping him with it. How do you like that? Is that fun? Do you like that? He says, please don't tell them. That's not right, I said. You're doing everything wrong.
One of the nuns said to me, who loves you? And we all sat there and she said, well, God loves you. And then the next time that question was brought up, who loves you? And I put my hand up right away. I was like, I know, God loves me. And she said, why would God love you? You're nothing less than a dog to God. That's the day I lost my voice. I didn't speak anymore in classroom.
You'd never see the kids around Sechelt, very seldom. But you'd see the nuns, they'd go shopping on the weekends, I guess. You'd never see one by herself. There was always two. They would never smile. They wouldn't hardly acknowledge you. It was weird. It was real weird. I couldn't understand why these ladies are supposed to be so good and they're just not friendly. And I knew that big ugly building was bad, and it was so good to see that old building ripped down. Somebody offered me a bunch of bricks from it. I didn't even want them. Yeah, it was pretty bad. See, nobody realized.
The more you go into your own language and culture, the more you heal. Because there's words in our language, you can't describe them in English. It's not describable. It's, you don't know how to say it in English. And that's what I learned. And I also learned that this animal, like this dog, the word was different. So it was chino. So what does chino mean? It means an animal with fur that's got a long tail. It's a description of what the animal looks like. And their descriptions were very precise in our language. I didn't know my language. So then the belief system for me was, I better learn my language because when I cross over, I want to be able to speak to them in our language. And that's what drove me to know it more and more.
I know a little bit of the language, but I'm more into my culture of carving. A lot of years have gone by before I really got into it, learning more about my culture as a Sechelt Nation member. The hummingbirds, as told by my late father-in-law, says it represents healing. So what an opportunity that was to use those designs of the hummingbirds on that pole for the hospital, the healing pole.
Discipline about life is about mind, body, and spirit. I think we got to come back to that. So that mind, body, and spirit is you got to be creating a balance about how you conduct your life, not just by the way you walk every day, but the very things that you eat, or the way you consume, the way that you breathe, the way that your spirit carries you is a whole discipline about life and creating that balance about life. Otherwise, if you're out of balance, then you're going to be miserable, right?
What's life all about? And what's happiness? living off the land and working together.
What I fight for is for the children. Where, like, I wish I had somebody to speak up for me when I was young, who could have told me all these different things that I tell all these other children in school. And I tell them their history of their family. And I'm like, your grandmother was such a beautiful person. And I still forage. I still go get cedar, and I do my cedar work. I do my weaving. I do medicine. I'm really passionate about medicine. And we go and pick our own teas. And it's like doing a complete circle from when you were a child to now. And I'm like, hey, I done that. You know, you get that when you've done it, it's done. So what do I do now? So I figured the best thing I could do is just share my stories.
One of the things that I'm really proud of as a Sechelt person is the strength and power of our people, because we worked as a collective. And I know the Sechelt people were known throughout the coast as orators and great storytellers. I've always been really proud of the fact that we have this really rich culture, and we really utilize those skills to the fullest to help our people.